Good enough. Well, good morning. And it's time for Sunday school again. And we're getting a little bit of a late start. Too many things going on, but we'll try to rush through. So you listen fast, okay? And we'll be good. We have a standalone unit that's entitled Avoiding a Critical Spirit. I don't believe there's ever a person anywhere who's been so even keeled or so humble or so in the right spirit or the right attitude that they haven't at some point or another criticized or overly critiqued something or someone in their lives. It's just part of human nature. Why? It's because critical spirits are fed by pride, by jealousy, and all kinds of humanistic evil things. And I don't believe there's a person anywhere that this won't speak to or won't hit. And I do believe that we need to learn how to avoid a critical spirit. Of course, we do that by depending and trusting in the Lord. We can second guess things. Everybody's a Monday morning quarterback kind of thing, and you say, well, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? They'd won the game if they hadn't done this, or if the ref hadn't called that play, we can become, yeah, or I mean, the ref hadn't controlled that play, whatever. We can, call all kinds of things. But the bottom line is being critical never solves anything, it never fixes anything. As a matter of fact, it really destroys us and it destroys our relationship with God because basically we're saying the way it turned out isn't the way it should have turned out. Um, we know better. And we just have to trust that the way things go and the way things happen, that God is sovereign and He is in control. Ellen and I are kind of like, sometimes after we see something and we think, what was that? And she and I'll talk and we'll say, didn't see that one coming. What are you doing, God? We didn't even see that one coming. And yet, we just have to trust that the Lord is in control. Well, we're going to go to the book of Numbers, chapter 12, and I'm not going to give you a lot of background on this. I just kind of want to jump in and kind of look over what's going on here and then figure out what it is for us. Okay, that's what we'll do in the time we have together. So let's do that. Numbers chapter 12, verses 1-3 says, Miriam and Aaron, who are they? Well, that's Moses' sister. Remember, she saved him saved his life from Pharaoh killing him. And then he was raised in Pharaoh's court. And then his brother Aaron. Aaron is the one that God used to speak for Moses. Moses, when he was out and saw the burning bush, he'd run away because he killed a Egyptian, and he fled for his life, and he ended up out in the wilderness of Midian. And when he saw the burning bush on the mountain and God told him to go and deliver his people, Moses stuttered and stammered around and said, I can't talk. And God said, don't worry about it. Aaron, your brother, is going to speak for you. So here's Moses' sister, who was his lifesaver. And here's Moses' brother, who has been his spokesperson. And they all left Egypt when Pharaoh finally let them go after the plagues. So Miriam and Aaron, criticized Moses because of the Cushite woman he married, for he had married a Cushite woman. That's a whole other topic, isn't it? And they said, does the Lord speak only through Moses? Does he not also speak through us? And the Lord heard it. Moses was a very humble man, more so than any on the face of the earth. Well, there's a lot of complications in this. But what I really want you to understand and figure out is that comparing yourself to others can lead to a critical spirit. Anytime we start looking and saying, well, I could have done that. Well, I could have done that better. Well, why didn't they ask me to do that? Well, am I not in charge of this kind of thing? Well, folks, because you're not. And it doesn't make you any less of a person. No. Does it make those persons any better? Well, maybe they are, but it's up to God to determine that, isn't it? It's up to God to be in charge of that kind of thing. So here they've been out there in the wilderness. They've been out there for about a year and a half or so when this came up. Somewhere along the way, Moses, when the plagues began to hit, you might recall he sent his wife Zipporah and his boys, his sons, back to Midian. And so then, once they got out of the wilderness and Jethro, his father-in-law, heard that they had been delivered from Egypt, then Jethro brought Moses' wife Zipporah to him. There are some who suggest that this might have been another wife that Moses married along the way, and maybe she was from the land of Cush. But we know that Zipporah was from Midian. And we do know that Jethro, her father, Moses' father-in-law, was a God-fearer. And so, they were godly people. They were wholesome people. So who are they criticizing here? What are they doing? And was it Zipporah? Was it another wife? Some would say, well, he must have taken another wife. I don't know. If we don't really have the facts, I don't really know what that is. The bottom line is, it's more of a slang, I believe, well, the way they're saying this, than it is anything else. So when Zipporah came back, and she'd been there a while now, about a year, was there a conflict? Was there a problem? Some say that there was an argument because when Jethro came back and he saw that Moses is being the judge over all these millions of people, trying to keep things straight, and Jethro said to him, what you need to do is you need to divide this up, and you need to put some people in charge of so many people, and delegate some authority out and let other people take care of this. They can do what you do. And some say that maybe finally Miriam and Aaron, even though I think it was mostly Miriam as the instigator of all of this, it may be that finally they got tired of not being the ones in charge of everything, and that Moses was the one. And so they're kind of saying, doesn't God speak through us? Doesn't God use us? What's the deal? Why is Moses getting all the praise? Why is he getting everything? Well, that's really the bottom line, isn't it? And so we can argue all these other things that we just speculate on and don't know. The reality of it is they let their pride and their jealousy get the best of them. And the saddest thing out of these 3 verses is the Lord heard it. Nothing goes unheard by the Lord. Nothing goes unnoticed by God, who is the creator of even you and me, all the universe and all things that there is. Nothing goes past him. Some would even come back and say, well, did Moses really write the Pentateuch? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Because why would he say, if he was really a humble man, why would he say he was the most humble man of ever, that there ever was? Well, if you understand how redaction criticism kind of works, somebody may have embellished that along the way. All they had was stories. And then did Moses put it in writing? Did he put it down? Maybe he did. Maybe he had help. Maybe others began to put this together. I believe a lot of it happened during the reign of Solomon, when they were at peace. And a lot of this stuff began to come from the stories and begin to be redacted into what we have as our written scripture. Did it change? No, it's still the same. Did they have one group or another group that might have added some things to it? Possibly. Could this statement have been redactors' statement saying that this was true about Moses? Yeah. Did he make it up? No, probably not. I think Moses probably was a pretty humble man. Even though he did get a little bit irritated about a couple things, he probably was a very humble man. And so does that discredit any of that? No. The reality of this process is we have 2 people who are in leadership position, helping Moses along the way, happen to be his siblings. And for some reason, they got very irritated about this. Where were they? Well, they were at a place called Hazeroth. We don't know exactly where the location of that is, but they had traveled there. Were they on their way somewhere else? Probably. But when they got there and all of a sudden this came up, that wasn't good. Now, I'm going to tell you, I've been on mission trips, and I've been the leader of mission trips. And there's always going to be somebody who's a little bit critical on the journey. But sometimes you can't stop the journey. You need to keep going until you get to where you're going. And sometimes then you need to work out the details or fix it. Well, I think they were kind of like on a mission trip, and they're on the journey, and they stopped, and they had to fix this problem then because there was somebody who thought they ought to be the leader, Miriam and Aaron, and probably more Aaron or Miriam, which is strange because Miriam was just the big sister. Aaron was the spokesperson, and yet you get the knowledge of knowing that he might have been speaking, but he knew it wasn't God who was telling him to speak this. And so that's a good thought out of that too, isn't it? So they're going along the way. They get to this place called Hazeroth, and there they are, and they have to stop. And so the time comes for them to figure out how to deal with this problem. Folks, comparing yourself to others can always lead to a critical spirit. Well, the next thing then is we go to the next verses. Verses 4-9 say, "Suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, 'You three come out of the tent of meeting.'" So they were in the makeshift tabernacle where they were worshiping. A tabernacle had been constructed. Everything was going on with that. They were using that to worship God along their journey as they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And he says, "You three come out of the tent of meeting." So the three of them went out. Now, how did they know the Lord spoke to them? Well, because it says, "Then the Lord descended in a pillar of cloud, stood at the entrance of the tent, and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them came forward, he said, 'Listen to what I say. If there is a prophet among you from the Lord, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. I speak with him directly, openly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. So why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?' The Lord's anger burned against them, and he left." Whoa. That's the last thing you want to do, isn't it? Is God to take his presence away from us. But that's exactly what happened. The Lord's anger burned against them, and he left. They drove God away. Man, folks, that's pretty harsh stuff, isn't it? So what's going on here? Well, God called him out, didn't he? He called him on the carpet, as they say, that's that old phrase. Called him on the carpet on this one, and set him straight there. Well, he did. And basically he said, look, if there's anybody who's going to be a prophet among you, it's only because I appointed them that. It's only because I have made it possible for them to speak and to do that kind of thing. That's what God's saying there. And so he says, you guys need to get it straight. It reminds me some of what God said to Job. When God spoke to Job and he said to him, "Look, where were you when I created the world? Where were you when I appointed this, when I did this and I did that? Hadn't even come along yet, had you?" Well, that's because, as Dr. Gary Galliotti, Old Testament professor at Southwest Baptist University, Bolivar, Missouri, 65613, used to say, he would say, God is sovereign and infinite. Man is finite and sinful. Never forget it. It's true, isn't it? It is true. So what does God say? He says, look, I speak to Moses alone. And up until the time they constructed the tabernacle, they had a tent. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Thank you. And they had a tent. And the tent was where Moses would go, and the pillar of cloud of God's presence would descend, and God would speak to Moses, and Moses would get directions from God. So God is basically saying, look, don't you remember before we made the tabernacle, me and Moses were talking. We were sharing stuff direct and to the point here. I didn't speak in riddles to him. I didn't, say, go figure this one out and then you'll know what to do. No, God told him exactly directly what he was supposed to do, openly, securely. So then he says to them at the latter part of verse 8, why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? In other words, we might criticize people, we might say things bad about people, but we ought to be afraid because God is listening. God knows what we say about other people. He knows whether we're speaking in a negative or a derogatory way about someone else. And if it's something that I believe, especially that God has told that person to do, and we're against it, then we're against God. God's not going to take that very, very lightly. And so he didn't here, did he? His anger burned against them and he left. The term when he said, I speak to him directly, he's basically saying mouth to mouth. face to face. Even though we know Moses couldn't look at God's face and live because no one can, is what God told him. But we do know that God hit him in the cleft of the rock, and then he passed by. And when he passed by, then Moses was able to look at God's the backside of him. He could see the form of the Lord. And so that's what it says here. I don't speak in open riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. So Moses had a better connection with God. And then we get to the last point, which says that we should confess a critical spirit and return to God. Numbers 12:10-15. As the cloud moved away from the tent, Miriam's skin suddenly became diseased, resembling snow. Why did that happen to her? Because I think she was the instigator of it. I'm not down on women, not coming after them or anything like that. I'm just saying I think she might have been the instigator. And I think God also knew once Aaron saw that there was a problem, he's going to confess. Oh, guess what happens? That's what he does. So when Aaron turned toward her, he saw that she was diseased and said to Moses, "My Lord, please don't hold against us this sin we have so foolishly committed." He didn't just include himself, and he certainly didn't point them at her solely. He said, "It's us, it's me and her, it's we. Please don't let her be like a dead baby whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb." And then Moses cried out to the Lord, "God, please heal her." And the Lord answered Moses, "If her father had merely spit in her face, wouldn't she remain in disgrace for 7 days?" In other words, there were certain things for purity and for cleansing that you got to do. And so he said, the Lord said, "Let her be confined outside the camp for 7 days. And after that, she may be brought back in." So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on until Miriam was brought back in. So their little mission trip here, wandering through the wilderness, trying to get to the promised land, had a 7-day stop, didn't it? Because Miriam and Aaron had the wrong attitude about things, and they'd gotten critical spirits. And once God was able to remove that from them, then they could move on. They could fix it and they could go on. So you must confess that critical spirit and you must return to God. God, did she have leprosy? Well, we know that leprosy sometimes begins to appear like snow, and then it just really eats away the flesh, and then it's no longer snow. I think it's somewhat like what when Moses was on the mountain and he saw the burning bush, and God said to him, put your hand in your coat, in your robe there. And he did. And then when he took it out, it was covered with like leprosy. And then God said to him, put it back in. It's after he took the staff and he threw it down and turned into a snake. You remember that? And so I think it was similar to that God was saying, "Look, I'm still in charge here, and I get to choose who gets what part and who gets what other part. And it's up to me to do that. It's only up to you to obey. And don't be critical and don't be mean or hateful about it. Just keep on doing what I've called you to do." And that's really what we are supposed to do, isn't it? So 7 days later, Miriam was confined outside the camp. Never really says she was healed, but we think she must have been, or they'd left her there. And she got to come back inside the camp. But we never hear of her ever again until she dies. You don't want to do something in the sight of the Lord that's harmful or against any of God's anointed. Because when you do, not only may God lift his hand from you and the mission or the calling he's placed on you, he may keep you from doing anything else for him. And so that was the picture that we get from there. Did he still use Aaron? Yeah. Think about Aaron. He was the high priest. He got to become the high priest. And not only that, but God gave him a whole tribe, the Levites, one of the 12 tribes, gave him the whole tribe to be priests along with him. So did God continue to use Aaron? Yeah. So does it mean that just because we sin, God can't use us? No. It's up to God, isn't it? I've known several people who had major sins in their lives, and they would say, "Can God ever use me again?" And I can't answer that, but God can. And unless you make yourself willing to be used by him, you'll never know, will you? You'll just never know. And so that's what really we have to do, isn't it? We have to trust the Lord. Well, that's a great lesson. And next quarter, we will begin with mentoring, investing in others. Man, that is so needed. We'll talk about that next week. God bless y'all. Bye-bye.